But because you put her together and you knit her together as just as you did us, we know that you know the remedy for her. Whatever healing process is necessary, I know that you will sustain her and that you will provide it, Lord. Whether it's through a direct miracle from you, or whether you use whatever means necessary in this world to make that possible. I know you will do it because you care for your people, Lord, and you have asked us to pray for one another, and so we are. And Lord, if there's anyone else struggling with any other issues, whether it's health, mental, or whatever it might be, we ask that you will heal those things, Lord, that you will take care of them, that you'll provide all the necessary things to make them feel better. We want to just thank you, Lord, because we know that you're with us this morning and that you will continue with us, and that you will abide with us, that you will sustain us, Lord. Give us wisdom and discernment. Help us to really appreciate your word. Help those of us that handle the word. We ask that you will help us to be able to do this wisely and through the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And we ask that the rest of us will be able to be receptive to your word and discern whatever message you want to give your people, Lord, and apply it in a very practical and meaningful way. And so we ask that you'll abide with us this morning, Lord, throughout the rest of our day of rest, and that you'll forgive us for our shortcomings and weaknesses, and we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. We're back to our topic from last week. We'll finish it off this week. And the bigger question that we're looking at is pacifism and the Christian, and whether pacifism is something that's part of the Christian life. And we looked at that last week, and we'll look at that again some more this week. And what we talked about last week in review is we looked particularly at the Ten Commandment application example. Remember those verses that follow right after the Ten Commandments are application examples, how to apply the Ten Commandments to life situations. And one of those life situations, as we saw, was what happens if somebody is stealing your stuff. And if you stop them with violence, what happens if you kill them? And so it puts into play two commandments, thou shalt not steal and you shall not murder. And so it's an interesting question because you have two commandments kind of opposed to each other. And so what we see in that is that theft is wrong, and so defense of the property is really expected. The answer to that question is that if someone is stealing your stuff, you have every reason to, because they've broken the law, you have every reason to get them to stop stealing your stuff. You can take whatever actions are necessary there. And the law would be meaningless if there wasn't the ability to enforce it. And so we see that in our own laws too. If we see that if people don't enforce the law, then people who are criminals will continue to do what's wrong. And so it's necessary to have enforcement. So it's just kind of a natural expectation. We tend to think in terms of a body of legal support, the police, the judges, that whole system in our lives, but it wasn't always that way, and it hasn't always been that way, and it may not be that way in the future either. In a large society, we have police and we have people like that who are kind of, it's their job to take care of you and take care of these situations. But nonetheless, at the front end of it, there's always you. You are the person who is ultimately responsible for defending your own property, your own stuff. And as it was in Bible times, and remember that this 10th commandment was given to the Israelites while they were in the wilderness. And so it would only be talking about other Israelites stealing from other Israelites. So it's there are bad people everywhere at all times, and the defense of your property and your life, in fact, is ultimately up to you. So it's just a natural expectation of that law. If it's wrong to steal, then it's right to defend your property from being stolen. And so, as I said, that commandment or that example of the commandments application brings into call those two commandments. What happens if the thief is killed while defending the property? So one person is breaking the commandment to steal, and the other person has killed somebody. And so who's in the right, who's in the wrong? And so if you are only defending your property, is what we learned from that last week, is it was unintentional. It wasn't murder. You didn't have any intention to kill the person. Perhaps it was dark out, and the commandment example speaks directly to that situation of when it's dark out and you're defending your property, you might be swinging a stick or an axe or who knows what. And you, without really intending to, you've managed to hurt somebody or kill them serious and make it a much serious thing. And so what it said was, if it's in the dark, and really from that we understood when it's unintentional, then it isn't murder. And what we see more deeply in that when we look into that is life is more important than property, but property is still important. Property doesn't have no value, and that's very true of our lives. And even though we're kind of a rich country, a rich population, we often have insurance and things like that. In many other countries, they don't have that sort of thing. But it's still a true thing to us. If you've ever been robbed or burglarized, we've been burglarized twice in this house. And we know what that brings for you. It brings kind of a fear and a sadness and a concern. And so there's other damage other than just that property damage, property loss. And so, but we understand that life is more important, but property still has importance in our lives, and it's still, for some of us, it's a necessary part of our existence. It might be the job that we have, the work that we do, those kind of things. So it could be a serious financial loss. And so what we see there is that the theft is wrong. It's acceptable to enforce the law against that and stop the person with whatever means are necessary. But it should never be in our heart to kill that person. It's always a heart thing, and I keep coming back to that. What's in your heart? If it's only in your heart to defend your property and the person is killed unintentionally, that's fine. If you're really looking to kill somebody because he stole your stuff, that's a problem, and you need to look at that in yourself and address that. So if defense of the property is expected, then so is defense of the property of others, okay? And so this is extending that same idea. If your property is valuable enough that you will defend it, then the property of other people should be valuable enough that you would defend it for them. And when you do that, you also have kind of stepped up the application to a bigger group of people. It's not just you and your property now, it's you and somebody else's property. And you would defend somebody else's property as an act of love. You would do that to help them in their situation, help them in the same way that you would expect them to help you. So that's very golden rule application as well. So if life is more important, though, defense of your life is also expected. So you extend that commandment into defending your life. So if life is more than property, then defending your life is also an expected thing. If someone is trying to hurt you or kill you, defense of your life would be a natural expectation. And in the same way, defense of other people's lives would be a natural extension of that. So if someone, a friend, a neighbor, whatever, is being attacked and hurt, it would be an act of love to defend them, to do what you can to help them. That's just kind of a natural thing. And so we see now that this idea of it's not just property, it's also about your life and the life of other people. So all of this is expanding into a much bigger idea. And so the next step in that is that if it's okay to protect the property of another person and defend the life of another person, it's all right to hire people to do that in your place. And we talked last week about what if you're the landowner of a great big land property, you couldn't possibly protect all of the people and all of the lives on there. You would hire some people who had specifically that job of protection. And that's in a society where you don't have police and military, but that leads naturally to that idea of when a society becomes big enough to do so, it produces a police and it produces a military. And both of those are extensions of that same idea of defending your property, defending your lives. So we got quite a lot out of that commandment example. It was only a few verses, but there's a lot to pull out of it, as you might expect from that sort of thing. And so the next thing we looked at, we called packing heat at Passover, and that's packing a weapon at Passover. And we saw there that that the disciples were carrying weapons to the Passover meal, to the Seder that they were having. And so if Jesus was against his disciples carrying weapons, he missed opportunities to teach. And we talked about that idea that if Jesus had ever been against the idea of them carrying weapons, that would have been an ideal time to mention it. But he doesn't mention it. He says nothing about them. And so we know that if they carried those swords to that Passover meal, and they'd been with Jesus probably for 3 or 3.5 years at that point, they had been carrying swords for some period of time, maybe that entire 3.5 year period. So the disciples must have been carrying those for a long period of time. So we understand they just regularly carried those. And when Jesus asked them about swords, they didn't understand what he was really asking and saying. But nonetheless, they weren't shy to show off the fact that they were carrying swords. And they said, here's 2 of them. And so we see that they had them. They had been carrying them for some length of time. And later on that very day, later in that night, I guess, Peter slices off the ear of a soldier with one of those swords. And the only thing that Jesus says is, put away your sword, put it back in its sheath. And he doesn't scold him for carrying a sword, doesn't do anything like that. So what we really see from the Passover thing is an absence of Jesus trying to say anything against carrying weapons and protecting yourself. We'll talk about what else he says there in just a moment. But that's what we're going to see a lot today in the lesson is opportunities where you could have taken the opportunity, if you had wanted to say it's wrong to carry weapons or use weapons or fight in battles, all of those things, but the person involved, the authority involved, never says those sort of things. So that'll be a lot of the evidence that we look at again, and we looked at some of that last week with this Passover thing. Okay, so the other thing that happens when Jesus talks to Peter about having a sword, and Peter takes that to heart, and he uses it up on the Mount of Olives when the people come to get Jesus. The other thing that Jesus says there is, for all those who take up swords will die by swords. And so lots of people who are theologists, they look at this and understand this, and everyone agrees that Jesus can't mean this literally. It can't be taken literally, because if you take it literally, what he says is everyone who grabs a sword to use it will die by swords. And that's just not literally true. There are plenty of examples, even in the Bible, where that isn't true. And the one that we talked about last week was that Peter had just used a sword, and he doesn't die by the sword. If we can believe what the Catholics say about how he died, we aren't entirely sure about how he died, but there's no appearance that he did die by the sword. But we have an even better example. King David was a warrior for a big part of his life, and he died of old age. He didn't die by the sword. And so what Jesus says there can't be meant literally, because it isn't literally true. There are many people who have lived by the sword and who don't die by the sword. And so many people say, well, it must be a metaphor of some sort. Maybe it has a deeper meaning. And so for those people, they say, well, maybe the deeper meaning is that those who base their lives on the protection of the sword will die by the sword. But when you think about that for a little bit, it isn't really a true statement either. There's many exceptions in the world that we live in. There are lots of people who have lived by the sword and lived a ruthless life, and that's not how they die. They die of old age. Now, certainly some of them do die by the sword, but there are lots of gangsters and stuff who have lived their full lives and died of old age, and they've lived by the sword all their lives. So there are many exceptions in the world, so it's hard to accept that this metaphorical meaning would be what Jesus intended, that those who base their lives on the protection of the sword will die by the sword. And so that leaves us still with a question of, what does Jesus mean by this? And one of the things that people consider is maybe he's using an idiom. Maybe this is an idiomatic statement from that culture. And we talk about that a bit, and we'll deal with that some more today. So what's an idiom? An idiom is a phrase that has a meaning that isn't deducible from the individual words. It's something that you can't understand just by reading the words. And one of those in English is rain cats and dogs. And when we use that phrase, raining cats and dogs, we're talking about a really heavy rain. But when you take that literally, if you had never heard that expression before, raining cats and dogs, you would say, what? Cats and dogs falling from the sky? That can't be. And so you would be confused by that. And so that's the nature of idioms. Idioms is a bunch of words that go together that make sense as words, but as a phrase, they don't make any sense. You need to understand the kind of the secret meaning for them. And we pass that along. When you were young, you probably for the first time heard that expression "raining cats and dogs," and probably from your parents, and they explained to you what it meant when you said, "What does that mean?" And that's the way idioms work, is that someone has to explain it to you the first time, and then you know it ever after that, and you use it yourself. And so it's almost like learning a new word that has a meaning you didn't know before, but it's a phrase instead of a word. And every language has those. And I asked Cynthia to get one from Spanish. I won't try to pronounce this one. I hope you can read it on the screen. Um, and this one is an interesting one, and it's a good one, a good example of what we're saying here. This expression literally translated means throw the house out the window. And so if you had never heard that before in your whole life, you would say, what? You can't throw a house out of a window? That doesn't make any sense. And you wouldn't understand what's behind it. But what it means, the kind of deep meaning to it is spare no expense. Go ahead, spare no expense, go to it. And so that's very typical of idioms in all languages. Every culture has these idiomatic expressions that they use. And we use them a lot in our lives and don't even realize that they're such a natural part of how we express concepts. And these idioms are kind of nice that way. They kind of embed a whole concept into just a short phrase. And so this happens in the Bible too. The people in Bible times used idioms as well. And there's one of them in Luke 9 Luke chapter 9 verse 54, and there the translation in English says his face was set to go to Jerusalem. And you say, well, okay, his face isn't going anywhere without his body, so how does that make any sense? And what it really means is his mind was made up. He had already settled that that's what he was going to do, and this is talking about Paul. And so that's an idiom there. His face was set to go to Jerusalem is how it was used. And so idioms are a big part of every language, and every culture has these idioms. And there aren't always even the same idiom in every language. Sometimes there are. Sometimes two different languages will have the same concept in an idiom, but the idiom will be expressed in different ways. And some of them just don't have an idiom that is the same as an idiom in another one. And we run into that problem with Bible translations quite a bit. And honestly, this is one of them, where how do you take an idiom and translate it into something that makes sense to the person who is reading an English language Bible, when the Hebrew or the Aramaic or whatever it was has the idiom in it. And so that's a problem for translators. Often they do it literally, and people struggle to understand what was meant by that. And sometimes they try to change it into an idiom that we have, if there's one that's close, and it's a problem for translation. So going back to what Jesus said, and if that is what is an idiom, so we say if it's an idiom, how do you figure out the meaning? So if Jesus is saying these words, those who live by the sword die by the sword, well, that's not exactly what he said, but if he is using that, what does he mean by that? And how can we figure out what the meaning is if it's one of these things where you can't look at the words and figure it out? And you do that in the same way I was talking about when you learned it from your parents. You learn it from another source. You learn it from an example, or you study the context in the case of the Bible. So you look at the word and the context there and see if the context explains it. And it doesn't in this reference here that Jesus has on the Mount of Olives, but there's another one in Revelation where it does have the same idiom, and in that case it does explain the context. And so in this one in Revelation, it says, whoever leads into captivity goes into captivity, and those who murder with the sword will be killed with the sword. And so right there's that same idea. And so here is faith and the endurance of the holy ones. So in the context of this verse, which I haven't included, there's quite a few verses about this. You can read it and you can see what the message is here. And the message is, this is talking about the end times, of course, and talking about the unholy one, the Antichrist coming. And the message is, if you try to fight against him, you're going to lose. You're not going to succeed. He has been given this opportunity. It's his time to act. God has allowed him to act. And if you try to fight against him, if you try to take him captive, if you try to do anything against him, you're going to lose. You have no hope against this. And so it's a warning to us in that time that that's not something you can succeed against. And so, yeah, this is the idea behind that idiom is there are some battles you can't win. You might simplify it down to that. Some that if you fight them, you can't win. We don't have an idiom that's like that one. So we see in Revelation that idea of an unwinnable battle, and that perfectly explains what Jesus is saying to Peter. So it fits into the way Jesus used that. God had ordained that these things are going to happen to Jesus and that he's going to be taken captive. There was a prophecy about all these things. And so all of these things had to happen. And so Jesus is saying to Peter, this is going to happen. This is God's will, and you can't stop it. If you try to stop it, things are going to go badly for you. And so that explains, I hope, what Jesus means there, and a little bit about idioms and how they work. And often we use them without understanding what they are. So any questions on that?
Well, I just had a comment. Is that especially some verses, the one that you were quoting about picking up a sword and dying by the sword. Some of those are misquoted. They leave something out, or they take it out of context. In that case, is living by the sword is the problem. It's not the sword itself, but to live by it, to depend on it more than you depend on God. That's the big problem right there. And they do the same thing about money, for example. Everybody says money is the root of all evil, but that's not what it says. It says the love of money is the root of all evil. Exactly. So that changes the whole perspective altogether, So it just like a lot of these idioms and a lot of these quotes that you're talking about, they're misquoted and they're out of context, and people don't really know how to apply them properly.
Yeah, it's a problem for sure. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is evidence quality. And there are different kinds of evidence that can be presented for any argument. And some of it is really good quality evidence, and some of it is kind of iffy, and some of it is really bad evidence. And we're going to be seeing some examples of that. And so when we're talking about the Bible and understanding what the Bible is and using the Bible to support an idea or even against an idea, you want to get as much of the best evidence that you can and as little of the worst evidence that you can. And so the best evidence is when the Bible speaks directly on a point, and it really addresses that point directly. And so that's what we see with the Ten Commandments example or application example, is it speaks directly about this idea of protecting your property, defending your property. And it treats it as defending your property is entirely expected. And if the result of that is the death of the person who was trying to steal your stuff, and you really didn't want to kill him, it was really unintentional, that's not a problem. And so those verses there really address this very directly. And so that's our best evidence that we have. The so-so evidence that we have, and we're going to look at some more of today, is when there's a teachable moment, but nothing is said. And so there's a case, we saw that with Jesus at with the swords when they were having the Passover meal together. He doesn't say anything. If he had ever wanted to say anything about not carrying a sword or that sort of thing, he doesn't say anything. He's completely quiet on that. And again, later that night on the Temple Mount, he doesn't say anything that's bad about carrying a sword or using a sword to defend yourself. And so that's that evidence that is where it doesn't directly say anything about it, but by not saying something about it, it does say something. And this is called absence of evidence. But the reason that it's so-so evidence is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because Jesus didn't say anything doesn't mean that there isn't anything that he could have said or would have said or wanted to say there. So we have to be careful with that kind of evidence because it isn't conclusive evidence. It isn't the hard evidence that we'd really like to have. Now, the worst kind of evidence that you can have is applying a weakly related verse or a concept to the topic or something that's taken out of context, as Pastor Joe was just saying, or misunderstanding a verse. Those are the worst kinds of evidences, and we're going to see a little bit of that today too. And so we need to be careful how we understand the evidence that's presented to us and the value and the quality of that evidence that we're seeking. Okay, back to the main topic now, finally. So we talked about military service and police service, as really being extensions of our natural need to defend ourselves, to defend our property. But some people want to see military service as somehow different from police service and somehow different from defending yourself. But there really isn't any justification for that view. We've talked about this before, and we'll just kind of do it quickly here. The differences are really only in the scale of the battles. When you're defending your property, it's probably just you against one person, or if you are a person with a large property, maybe it's you and some friends against a small group of people. It's the scale in a war battle is much larger, but that's only the scale. That's just the number of people and the kinds of weapons that they use. So they have more people and bigger weapons, and that's really the only difference between military service, police service, and defending yourself. And so all of these groups, whether it's you defending yourself or the police defending you or the military defending you, they have that common purpose of protecting people from some aggressor who might be trying to steal their stuff or kill them or do whatever. And so we've hired these people, we've hired police, we've hired military to do these things for us, to protect us, because as individuals, we can't protect ourselves against those kind of threats. So, and in Old Testament times, we talked about this last week too, we don't see a standing military or police. They were the same thing at that time. People were ordinary people who worked in their fields, harvested their crops, raised up their lambs and goats. And when there was a call that they needed to go out and fight some attacking enemy from another country, or who knows what the problem was that they might have had to delete, it might have been raiders. That was a common problem. If you remember that David actually acted as a raider for a period of time in his life. And so raiders would go charging into a city and try to grab up everything they could and steal it all. And so one of the things that was necessary at that time was to protect yourself, your town, against raiders. And so nowadays we would have a police force who would do that sort of thing. But back then, there wasn't a police force, so the people just got together and they did that defense themselves. That was normally, or sometimes they hired a small group. With David, again, there was also a period of time when he acted as a defense force for an area and made sure that nobody attacked their crops or their property. So at that time, there was a different situation going on from the way we live our lives now. And they didn't have the organization, have those police services and standing military. And so to make this idea, I think that somehow military service and police service and defending yourself are different things is really a hypocrisy. It's really not being honest about what they are. And it's especially bad when you expect the military to protect you. You're living in a country that is protected by a military, and yet you think military service is wrong. And so if you're honest about that, that's you're using two different standards there. You're accepting the protection of the military, and yet you think the military service is wrong. And so another one that goes along with that is believing that military service is wrong, but police service is good, because they're really only different in scale and weapons. It's the same idea. It's defending property, it's defending people. And so there really aren't any differences in those three levels, whether it's personal defense, police service, or military service. And there is a case where military service is addressed. This is another one of those examples where a person, in this case John the Baptist, could have said something but didn't say anything. And so this comes from a New Testament reference, John the Baptist. And what's happening here is a number of people are asking John about how they should live their lives. And remember that John the Baptist's purpose was to bring people back to the Word of God. And that's what he was doing. He was laying a foundation for Jesus, so that when Jesus would come, the people had more or less turned back to him. And so John is really reintroducing them to biblical concepts. And so they're asking him about different things. And how shall we live? What shall we do? And so this verse comes from Luke chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. It says, "And tax collectors came also to be baptized. And they were saying to him, John the Baptist, 'Teacher, what shall we do?'" Now, remember, the tax collectors were really despised at that time. And some of them were dishonest. Others probably were not. But John said to them, "Do not require anything on top of whatever is commanded you to require." So he's saying, whatever taxes you're commanded to expect from the people, collect only those. Don't collect more than those. And so that's the kind of way that he was advising people who were turning back to the Bible and biblical principles. Next, the verse says, and soldiers were asking him, and they were saying, what shall we do also? He said to them, do harm to no man, do no injustice, and let your wages be sufficient for you. Now, when he says do harm to no man, he isn't talking about fighting in battles. He's talking about abusing people in the streets, hurting people when you don't need to hurt them. Remember that they were at the same time the police force and the military force. So soldiers were serving as both of those in that time. So what he doesn't say is, he doesn't say, get out of the military, get out of the service. You can't be there. It's against God to do that. And so if that had been something that he believed, that would have been a time for him to say it, but he doesn't say it. And so instead, he instructs them in not abusing their authority. Don't hurt people just because you're a soldier and you can get away with it. Treat people justly, fairly, treat everyone fairly the same way. And he teaches them about contentment. Be satisfied with what you have from what you're getting. And so those things that he does teach are important things, and they're even Ten Commandment based things. But he doesn't say get out of the service. He doesn't say quit the military. So that's not one of those kind of evidences where John could have said something but didn't say anything. Now, we talked about this last week also. Pastor Joe told a little bit of this, and I'll just kind of review it here. Pastor Joe served as a non-combatant. And while he was doing that service, he realized that he was patching up people to send them out to kill more people. And there's just no escaping that, is that even though you're a non-combatant, you are still supporting the military. You are still making it happen, making it possible for this fighting to go on. And the truth is that during a war, even the people at home are fighting the war. The families are supporting their people who are in the service and doing the fighting. They're sending care packages. They're keeping in contact with them. They're doing all those kinds of things to support the people who are in the service. There are people who are going to work, and the work that they do pays taxes, and those taxes make it possible to fight the war. So even the people who are just going about their normal daily businesses are still fighting the war, because some of their tax money is going to do that. And possibly even the people at home. We've never seen that in this country, but in other countries, they've been attacked as part of the war. If you remember, Britain was bombed almost incessantly, very heavily, and their homes and their businesses were destroyed in some cases. People were killed. And so sometimes the people who are not the military service are also paying the price of fighting that war. So the war is being fought and experienced by them too. And some of the people also work in resistance movements against invaders. Again, this country has never been invaded in that way. But generally, and we saw that with the French in World War II, a lot of the French people turned to a resistance movement, and they were fighting against the invaders at home doing that. So military service really isn't just about the people who do the fighting, and anybody in the military knows that. Can someone mute that? Okay, so
not sure where that's coming from. Let's see. Oh, nobody gets offended if I mute you.
Okay, so we see that military service, as I was saying, also, you know this if you're in the military, it isn't just the people who are at the pointy end of the gun who are doing the fighting. Military service is all of the people who are bringing supplies to them, bringing food to them. It's all of those sorts of things. All the non-combatant roles are all serving that. And that trickles all the way down to the people at home who are supporting those people who are fighting, doing the actual fighting. So the attempt to understand military service as being somehow something distinct from police service and self-defense is really not supported by any ideas. They're all just different in scale, but the same idea behind them. Now, there is something that God is definitely against for a kind of military service, and that's military service in a conquering army, an army that goes out to steal, to conquer countries, to do things like that. And this is a distinction in military service that is really worth mentioning here. And this army of conquest, God speaks against that specifically in Habakkuk. And in Habakkuk, God is talking to Habakkuk about a force that's going to come through Israel and blow through Israel like a storm and wipe out Israel. And he says, nonetheless, they will be punished for what they have done for attacking Israel. So God is using this. It turns out to be the Babylonians who are going to do this. And the Babylonians wipe through Israel and leave it just a shambles of what it was. And God says they will be destroyed because of it, and they were. History records that. So God is definitely against a conquering army. The problem with a conquering army is that military service often requires a commitment of time. You have to say, I'm going to be there for 3 years or 4 years or whatever it is you're signing up for. And if you try to sneak out early because the nature of the army has changed, you don't really have that option. Of course, you have that option, but they'll throw you in jail if they get the opportunity. So so you need to understand, if you're going to go into military service, where you could be the person who works the pointy end of the stick, a defensive army can sometimes become a conquering army, or get into really a gray area of almost a conquering army. And so you need to be aware of that and consider that as part of your planning for your future, if you're looking at that idea of becoming part of a military service as a Christian. So that's just a sideline note to think about there. Any comments on that so far?
No, I think some of us folks, or some among us, might want to get in the military later on. But I guess we just got to be sure that you understand that we are in support of that, support of the military. I'm very much in support of the military myself, maybe just because I didn't carry a weapon did not mean that I didn't support the military. It's just that I felt I was designed for something else, and that's all that was. I didn't have any misunderstanding of what I was doing. Through most of the time I was in the military, I knew that I was part of the defense as much as anybody else. I really was, but I was okay with that. My conscience was clear. I felt that the Lord was blessing my willingness to serve Him, and it all worked out for the best. And I think it's pretty much going back. I thought you might want to quote that verse again, but it's the story between David and Solomon, where God would not allow David to build his sanctuary, but he wanted Solomon, because Solomon was a man of peace, but David was a man of war. And that wasn't a bad thing. It just meant that we were designed for different reasons. And so, that's where we're at with that. And this is not really completely in line with Church of God, to be honest with you, because I don't think they believe in any military service at all, but
right.
But then again, they haven't discussed that anymore in quite some time. I'd like for them to discuss it once again while I'm still living, and maybe they will rethink that a little bit better.
Yeah, I hope so too. Okay, moving on, and we're close to the finish here. We're going to talk a little bit about pacifist arguments, the arguments that they use to support this idea of no military service in particular, but not just military service. Some of them take it so far as complete pacifism, where you wouldn't try to stop anybody if they're trying to steal your stuff. And so one of the pacifist arguments, and this comes from the COG 7 doctrine book, This We Believe, it says, God authorized Moses, Joshua, and David to wage war. He hasn't done that in the New Covenant. And so what they're saying there is that it was only ever authorized to fight in a military for Moses, Joshua, and David. And it's not authorized for us to do that. And so we look at what they're saying there, and we see that it's a deceitful statement. It really is. They're as you might expect, they're using words in odd ways and using odd words. One of those is authorized. God didn't authorize people. He commanded them to go out and conquer. If you remember when they went into the promised land, and Jericho was the first place that they conquered, God said, go get them. Get those people out of the promised land. And so Authorized is a very curious word to use instead of commanded, because God was commanding them to do that. And it indicates a little bit about the author of these words. As a person who doesn't want to see God as a militaristic God, as a God who commands people to fight in wars, he wants to see God in a different way. And so he's used the word authorized instead. And authorized is a deceitful use of that word, because that's not really what God did. He commanded, he didn't authorize. And another thing that is deceitful there is the use of Moses, Joshua, and David. God didn't authorize them or even command them directly. He commanded all of the people to fight that battle. And it wasn't just those three people. And so that's also a bit deceptive, because it's and what the author is trying to do there is he's trying to refer to individuals in the Old Testament so that he can say that it applies to, what he's saying applies to individuals in the New Testament. And so he's trying to make a crossover there, but to say that God had only commanded Moses to go to war is wrong. He commanded all of the people to go to war. So it's a deceptive use of words in there to try and make a point. And this is the worst kind of evidence that you can have, is when you're finding it necessary to twist the verse a little bit or twist the ideas a little bit to make them say what you want them to say. And that's what's happening here. And what we need to look at to understand is, why? Well, yeah, we as Christians, we don't expect God to be calling us out to fight wars, but the reason is not because he hasn't done it. It's simply because the covenants are entirely different. The old covenant formed a physical nation with physical boundaries, and the new covenant is a spiritual nation made out of physical individuals still, but it's a spiritual nation. And so Christians are spread between the physical nations of many countries, and so we wouldn't have a nation to fight for. Christians don't have a nation like that. So the old covenant and the new covenant are very different in that way, and there wouldn't be any reason to expect that we would ever be called out to war by God. So it isn't just that God hasn't done it. It just wouldn't be a thing you could even do, because we don't have a nation to protect in the same way that the Jews had a nation to protect. Another argument, I don't think this one comes from the Doctrine book, but who knows, maybe it's there as well. I think I just pulled this one off the web. This is quoting Matthew 5:43 through 44. It says, "You have heard that it was said, show kindness to your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and bless the one who curses you, and do what is beautiful to the one who hates you, and pray over those who take you by force and persecute you." So the point that they're trying to make by using this verse is that you can't be killing someone you are supposed to love. If you love them, you wouldn't kill them. And that's actually a bad idea. It's not a biblical idea, surprisingly, although a lot of people kind of think that way. It is what I kind of call snuggle bear love. It's a love that isn't God's love. It's a love that never hurts anybody. And that's not God's kind of love. God's love includes justice. And so God punishes people who have done things wrong. He doesn't just love everybody to death, or maybe that's a bad example. Maybe it's an idiom. So God's love is more than just always caring for people. Sometimes it's also killing people, and that's how he makes and that's how he made Israel stronger, is by killing off the non-believers, the people who were fighting against God. Whenever God did a purge, those are the people that he would wipe out. It wasn't done randomly. And so that would leave a population that was purer. And so God was, in fact, using that to purify Israel and build them up into a nation that had less people who were against God and not getting the idea of following God. So this snuggle bear love is an idea that we should be careful about, because there's a lot of people who talk about that. In the past church, there was also people who were in that idea of, they wanted to believe in a God who was always nice and would never ever do anything bad, wouldn't call people to go out into battles, wouldn't send plagues on them. That was always somebody else, they tried to say. And so be careful about that idea. It's an incorrect idea, but that's what they're trying to use here. And the idea that if you can't be killing someone you're supposed to love, and so therefore you wouldn't ever go into battle. Go into a war. But if you're a policeman, you know that that isn't the case at all. You as a policeman, you would be expected to love all of the citizens of your city. Nonetheless, you might have to shoot somebody because he's misbehaving. Okay, so moving on. Yes.
Can I say something, please?
Yes.
That's where I think most of them, people who think that way, I really dislike when they use this phrase, what would Jesus do? That's the way they use it. That's the way they try to turn it, on true believers, and this idea that God is this, snuggle bear,
Yeah.
and that's it. That he loves everybody, he loves everything, and it doesn't matter what you do, what you are, it's okay. Because you're a human being and he loves everything and everybody that's crazy. In the Bible it says that a good father disciplines his children.
Yep.
And it just drives me crazy. That's
No, and that's a good point, and I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit too, because Jesus was sent here. Isaiah talks about him as a man who wouldn't even break a reed, and so as a man who is not a fighter, that's what Jesus' role was to be. But when Jesus comes again next time, it's not going to be like that. He's going to be starting by slaughtering a whole bunch of people. So it's going, that was, you only saw a part of the real Jesus in the first coming. In the second coming, you'll see another part of Jesus. And so this idea of Jesus only being about snuggle bear love, he wasn't always that. He was also the person who flipped over the tables and tossed the money changers' money around. So beware of that snuggle bear love idea of God. It isn't a biblical idea at all. And now also that statement there, show kindness to your neighbor and hate your enemy. Jesus is quoting something people believe, but they're not sure what, because that quote doesn't come from the Bible anywhere. And we tend to kind of adopt that idea sometimes. And it's not a bad idea, but those words certainly don't come from the Bible. And so people have wondered where they came from. And some people think that he may have been talking against the Pharisees or the priests or something who had been teaching that idea. Nonetheless, what he's saying there, showing kindness to your neighbor and hating your idea, is not a biblical idea. And Jesus isn't saying anything against a biblical idea. This has come from someplace else. So, and so the verse is really about personal conduct. It's not about police enforcement matters or military matters or anything like that. It's talking about how you normally treat people in your normal life. Yes, in your normal life, you're going to run into people who treat you badly, people who hate you because of what you are. And it's saying, pray over those people. Even if they make your life hard and difficult, pray for them. And as much as possible, be at peace with them, says Paul. And so that's really what's being said here. It's not an argument against military fighting or even police service. It's talking about your normal daily conduct, how your life is and how you live your life. And we continue that on, but just by looking at the remainder of the context of that verse. They only chose those two verses there. But if you look at the next verse, it says, so that you will become the children of your Father who is in heaven, for his sun rises on the good and upon the evil, and his rain descends on the just and on the unjust. So when you see that part of the verse there, or that particular verse, and add it to the other ones, you can see that the point that Jesus is making is that treat everybody the same, because your Father treats everyone the same. He treats the good and the evil the same. They both see the sunrise, they see the sunset, they get the benefit of the sun growing the crops. Everyone gets treated equally. The rain descends on the good just as well as it does on the bad. And so his point is, God treats everyone equally, be like him. And so that's really what this is talking about, is how you live your life. Treat everyone fairly, treat them justly. And so this, what is being said here in Matthew 5 is not about military service. It's not about police service or anything like that. It's about how you live your own personal life, how you treat people, and treating them justly is what is really being addressed here. So this is these two examples here have been examples of how you need to dig into the arguments that people make and dice them into their pieces and understand what's being said to them. Because sometimes these arguments sound really good. They sound like they make sense, but they really don't. They're wrong, and they have wrong doctrine and wrong ideas behind them. And so just as Cynthia was saying, they often present these ideas in nice ways. They sound good, but yeah, they're not the good thing. So more quickly now, we'll finish off here. So I just want to say one more thing on this topic, which is working within the laws of man. we saw those 10 commandment examples talking about how to handle that situation if somebody is stealing your stuff and you're trying to defend your stuff. But the commandments, nowhere in the Bible does it say that you must defend your property. That isn't a commandment to us, or our lives, or the lives of other people. The Bible doesn't say that. It only talks about love and what love would do. And love would do these things given the opportunity. So defending your property, defending your life or other lives, other people's property, those are personal choices that we make, and hopefully we make those with the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And just as Pastor Joe was saying earlier, is that he felt that he was doing what the Spirit wanted him to do by working as a non-combatant. That's fine. And so understand that there are, it's a personal choice that you make for yourself, how you're going to handle these situations. You don't have to do these things. And it's also going to be situational. Some real life aspects come into play here. There are some cases where it would be a foolish thing. And just as Jesus said, if you fight this battle, you're going to die. And so there are some situations where you wouldn't try to protect your property or your friends because it's just not going to work out right. It's if there's too many of those people or whatever the situation is where you've got a disadvantage, you can't do that. And so you need to use common sense in here as well and apply that to whatever situation you're in to determine how you're going to handle it. And that's just life. Life is full of all sorts of situations like that where we have to make critical decisions, life and death decisions. But keeping in mind that it's not a commandment, the applicable laws of the country must be obeyed. And this comes back to something that's going on in government right now, and Pastor Joe mentioned it last week too. There's this bill coming out that's going to try to restrict our ability to defend ourselves in our homes. And so the applicable laws of the country must be obeyed unless they conflict with the commandments given to us. But this is not a commandment. We aren't commanded to defend our property or our lives. And so if they do pass that legislation and the legislation says you're not allowed to defend your property or your lives, then you are not allowed to. You're required to follow the laws of the country unless they conflict with the laws of God. And so also, if going with it, if they restrict the kind of weapons you can use, you need to accept that. And so we are called to be good citizens in society and obey the laws. But still, there are gray areas. Life is like that. It's always gray areas. And so sometimes legislation that comes out becomes law, but it's not legal law. And in our case, we have a Supreme Court who often will shut down laws that aren't legal, and they will reject that. So you can end up in a situation here where new legislation was passed that says something, but you yourself believe that legislation is going to be thrown out by the Supreme Court once they get a chance to look at it. And so now you're in a gray area. What do you do? So wisdom and guidance of the Holy Spirit is foundational to applying this and doing the right thing at the right time in matters of defending yourself and involving yourself in all of these things, police or military. So quickly summarizing it up here, property defense, self-defense, police service, military service are all the same. They only differ in the size of the weapons and the size of the groups of people. They are really all about protecting people from other people who are trying to hurt them or steal their stuff. And the key principle behind all of this has been, what's in your heart? Do you want to kill somebody, or are you just trying to stop them from doing what is wrong? Stop them from stealing your stuff or stealing your neighbor's stuff. And so what's in your heart is always what's critical. And if our hearts are good, we will choose the right things. And the last point I want to make is pacifism as a concept is just not in the Bible anywhere. And we've talked about pacifism generally as being not defending yourself at all, but we also talked about police and military service. And we see plenty of examples where there were opportunities for someone like Jesus or John the Baptist to talk about, no, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't be in the military, but they don't say that. And so we have enough examples of that we feel good about the idea that this isn't a wrong thing to do, that Jesus isn't against it, that God isn't, the Bible isn't. And so we're comfortable with that idea that if the situation is right for us to defend ourselves or our property, we can do that. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you got something from that. Any last questions?
I think since Cynthia brought up that subject about what would Jesus do, I hadn't really thought about it, a lot until right now when she mentioned it. And that is that we're not Jesus, and we're not in the same position he is. It's, to me, if he really got angry with those people, he mentioned it at one time. If I wanted to defend myself, he says, I could bring a legion of angels and destroy all of you at one time. Of course, I'm paraphrasing,
Yeah.
but he had more to withhold and restrain himself than we do. I mean, we can't really match what he could do. And he withheld a lot because he has the capacity to, as you said earlier, a while ago, to destroy, and he will. But the point was, the reason he did what he did, and that was being very much of a pacifist, I believe that was because he came as a savior, and he didn't come to judge. But the next time when he comes as a judge, he's going to take on a completely different look. And what Jesus will do is very different from what he did in the past. And so I completely agree with you on that. But yeah, we're not Jesus, I mean, yeah, we should do the best that we can, try to be the best kind of person we can be. But we cannot walk in his shoes at all, And I just thought I'd throw that out there.
So that's a good thing to say, and I'm going to add some more to that. This idea of what would Jesus do is a good idea in many cases, and Jesus is supposed to be our role model, but we need to be careful. There are exceptions to that. We can't walk on water. Jesus did. So there's a whole bunch of cases like that, special circumstances where Jesus was a special person, and we can't be that kind of person. We can't do things that he did, and can't be expected to live exactly to those standards. So there's some value to it, but we need to be careful where we take it.